Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters, your Magic the Gathering source that helps you command your budget. This show and episodes like this one are possible thanks to viewers like you. If you're looking for an easy way to help support this show, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. Also, hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. Another easy way to support this show is with our TCG player affiliate links. So whether you're buying a deck or individual cards, you can use this general link right here or one in the description. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all their support. Hey everyone, Mitch coming in from the Commander's Core studio. Welcome to the show. So, Strixhaven spoiler season ended with a bang last Friday. So if you haven't seen my last quick take on Beledros Witherbloom, potentially the most powerful of all the Elder Dragons, make sure you go check that out. But although Strixhaven spoiler season is over, Strixhaven Commander spoiler season isn't, if that makes any sense. Basically, 5 of the Commander 2021 decks are coming out with Strixhaven, and the first of the 5, the Lorehold deck, has been revealed. And let me tell you, some of the cards in this deck are setting the bar really high for the other decks. I mean, if you've just read the thumbnail for this episode, it says that there is potentially a new Smothering Tithe. So let's get into that card and all the other new cards that have been revealed. But actually, really quick, again on quick takes like this one, my apologies if I make any mistakes. These cards were just revealed and I'm going to be giving you my quick thoughts on them, and I very well might misspeak. And also, if I somehow missed a card or whatnot, my bad as well. But regardless, with all that said, let's jump into it. So first off, let's talk about Monologue Tithe. Yes, that potentially new Smothering Tithe. It's an enchantment for 2 and a white, and it says, whenever an opponent casts their second spell each turn, you create a treasure token. So let's break this down in the differences between this and Smothering Tithe. First up, this one does cost 1 less mana. And Smothering Tithe gives you a treasure whenever an opponent refuses to pay 2 when drawing a card. First up, obviously, opponents are going to be drawing cards a lot more often than they are casting second spells. That being said, there is no paying tax option with this. So hypothetically, a player could actually gain no treasures from Smothering Tithe if players just paid the tax each time, though that is incredibly unlikely. But with Monologue Tithe, you are guaranteed to get that treasure because there is no tax, which is kind of ironic with the name being Monologue Tithe. Now, there are already cards out there that benefit you whenever second spells get cast, like From and Mangara. And obviously, in a game of Commander, this is bound to happen multiple times in a game. Depending on what decks you're playing against, this can be incredibly impactful. If you're playing against a low-to-the-ground deck or a Spellslinger deck, this can make you a ton of treasure. Unlike Smothering Tithe, though, this is not going to be anywhere near as consistent. Also, you can't really force-generate treasures with this, unlike Smothering Tithe with wheel effects. But still, this card can be incredibly impactful in a game, and keep in mind that it can make you more than 1 treasure in a turn. If 2 opponents cast 2 spells in a turn, congratulations, you get 2 treasures. Now, will this be anywhere near as popular as Smothering Tithe? I doubt it. But that doesn't mean that this can't be incredibly impactful in a game of Commander. One more thing I do want to note about this card. Much like Smothering Tithe, I really wish they would have made the cost on this more restrictive. If the goal is to give mono white more access to ramp, add in more white pips. So making this 1 white white or white 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 would have made it harder for other decks to justify including, and mono white decks would have an easy time doing so. Regardless, let's move on to another potential staple in Commander with our Chaomancer's map. It's an artifact for 2 and a white, and it says when it enters the battlefield, search your library for up to 2 basic plains cards, reveal them, put them in your hand, then shuffle. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under an opponent's control, if that player controls more lands than you, you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. So yeah, this card's gonna see play in pretty much every single mono-white deck that can afford it. Essentially, this is a fixed versioning. Versioning says whenever an opponent plays a land, you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. So it doesn't have that restriction that our Chaomancer's map does. But even with that restriction, that is exactly what white needs to catch up to other players. Again, if your color identity doesn't have access to decent ramp outside of Wayfarer's Bauble, then yeah, you're gonna really love this. Chances are incredibly high that at least 1 player at the table is playing green. So it is pretty much a guarantee that they're gonna have more lands than you. And every time a player plays a land or land ramps, you're gonna get the opportunity to put a land from your hand into play. That is until you catch up to the player that has the most lands. So yeah, this can provide you an incredible amount of value. And keep in mind that this goes and gets you 2 lands to help you out. So at the very least, this is pretty much a 3 mana ramp 2 spell. Cultivate, eat your heart out. So in my opinion, this is essentially as close as you can get to a guaranteed staple in mono white. but in my opinion, outside of mono white, there are going to be plenty of other decks that want this as well. Essentially, if you're not playing green, you're probably going to want to consider this. And if you are playing green, you still might consider it, who knows? But basically, if you've got a deck that is pretty much guaranteed to not have the most lands in play, then this says, hey, you get to now have the most lands in play. Or sorry, I should say tied for the most lands in play. So yeah, this I can see being incredibly expensive because it's going to see play in a ton of decks. But next up, let's move on to Cursed Mirror, which is an artifact for 2 and a red, and it taps for a red, and it says, as it enters the battlefield, you may have it become a copy of any creature on the battlefield until end of turn, except that has haste. So this is a mana rock with a huge amount of upside and value, but just for 1 turn. I mean, this is essentially a heat shimmer that becomes a mana rock. Now, if you've been following this channel for a while, you know that I'm a fan of efficient ramp. So with mana rocks, you essentially want to tap for at least half the amount of mana that you put into it. So if your mana rock costs 2, you want it to tap for 1, cost 4, tap for 2, etc, etc. Now there are exceptions when it comes to mana rocks that have a lot of utility. And this can be game-ending utility. Maybe you're running a deck that's got a ton of creatures that have a lot of powerful ETBs. Being able to get that ETB again and then attack with that creature if you want, or just keep it back as a mana rock is huge. And keep in mind, this can be a copy of any creature on the battlefield, not just one of your own. Maybe one of your opponents is running the Dragon. Congratulations, now you get an Dragon that you can swing with. So you can dish out a ton of damage and get a powerful attack trigger. And again, you still get the value of this being a mana rock once that effect is gone. So again, even though this is an inefficient mana rock, it does give you a ton of utility. And actually, this could be an efficient mana rock if you, say, copied a creature that tapped for more than 1 mana, so there is that possibility too. Now, overall, I'm not sure exactly how popular this card is going to be, but there are definitely going to be some decks out there that really want this card. And speaking of a card that some decks are really going to want, there's Battle Mage's Bracers. It's an equipment for 2 and a red, and it says equipped creature has haste. It has whenever an ability of equipped creature is activated. If it isn't a mana ability, you may pay 1. If you do copy that ability, you may choose new targets for the copy, equip 2. So this card is definitely a callback to Illusionist Bracers. Now there are some differences between the two cards, most notably that Illusionist Bracers can go into any deck, whereas red needs to be part of your color identity for Battle Mage's Bracers. The other difference is that with this one, you have to pay 1 in order to copy that ability. Now that's not a huge difference, but it is a small one. But to make up for that, this does give your creature haste. So if you've got the mana for it, you can get that activated ability and the copy of it right away. Now, Illusionist Bracers does see play in a decent amount of decks, and pretty much any of those decks that also have access to red are gonna probably want this card. There are a lot of commanders out there with some really powerful activated abilities, so doubling it up can be an incredibly powerful thing. But next up, let's move on to a new card in a new mechanic with Excavation Technique. It's a sorcery for 3 and a white, and it says Demonstrate. So when you cast this spell, you may copy it. If you do choose an opponent to also copy it, players may choose new targets for their copies. It says destroy target non-land permanent, its controller creates 2 treasure tokens. So let's first break down this new mechanic. You basically can just say, hey, do you want to copy this spell for free to any opponent? Or should I say any one opponent? You cannot give it to multiple opponents. So this can be a fantastic political tool. If someone has 2 problematic permanents on the board, you can ask another opponent if they would like to help you destroy those things. So I really like the concept and the ability to wheel and deal in a game of Commander with things like this. What I don't like about this card and what might hold it back are 2 things. First off, it's a sorcery for 4 mana. There are plenty of fantastic removal spells out there that can get rid of pretty much anything that costs 3 or less. Also, when you're destroying that non-land permanent, you're giving that opponent 2 treasures. Whereas with something like Beast Within, you were giving them a 3/3 creature token. And in a game of Commander, I would much rather give one player a 3/3 instead of some treasures. So yes, I might be underrating this card. You are technically getting rid of 2 non-land permanents, but you're giving away 4 treasures in total. Though that's probably not going to happen when you're in a one-on-one situation at the end of the game. So overall, I like this new mechanic, but I don't think that Excavation Technique will be seeing all that much play. If you've got a deck that heavily focuses on politics like a Queen Marchesa, you might want to consider it though. But now let's move on to another new card with Bronze Guardian. Bronze Guardian is a star 5 golem that costs 4 and a white that has double strike and ward 2. So ward is a new mechanic from Strixhaven that says whenever this creature becomes the target of a spell or ability opponent controls, counter it unless that player pays 2. It also has other artifacts you control have ward 2, and Bronze Guardian's power is equal to the number of artifacts you control. So there's a lot going on here, but let's break it down. Ward 2 might not be as effective as something like Hexproof, but it can still be very good protection. An extra 2 mana to target any of your artifacts is a huge deal. So it might not be Padim levels of protection, but it's enough usually to protect most of your things. Or at the very least, if your opponent's going to try to get rid of one of them, they've got to pay extra. But secondly, on top of protecting your artifacts, this card can be an absolute beast. In a deck built around artifacts, you're going to have a ton of artifacts in play. And then on top of that power, this thing has double strike. So let's just even pick a safe number. Let's say that you've got 5 artifacts in play. For 5 mana, you've got something that protects all of your artifacts and hits for 10. And of course, in a deck built around artifacts, you can easily get that number even higher. It can be really easy for those kinds of decks to get 10 plus artifacts in play, and then your opponents really got to look out for this guy. So overall, I can see this card seeing a lot of play in artifact-centric decks. And speaking of artifacts, let's move on to Ruin Grinder. Ruin Grinder is a 7/4 construct with Menace that costs 5 and a red. It has when it dies, each player may discard their hand, then draw 7 cards. And it's got Mountain Cycling for 2. Now, Mountain Cycling is kind of an old mechanic. Basically, you pay 2, discard this card, then go get a mountain from your library and shuffle your library. But the main thing that is interesting on this card is that it is a wheel on death. Though for your opponents, it is an optional wheel. Now, where I can see this seeing some play are in decks that can get artifacts out of the graveyard and back into play and sacrifice them, so you can get a lot of value out of this. Basically, you get it out, you sack it, you wheel, you get it back out, you sack it, you wheel, so on and so forth. You can draw an absurd amount of cards, though again, unlike other wheels, you can't force your opponents to discard a hand if they've got a good hand. Keep in mind, in those types of decks, that Mountain Cycling can come in really handy though. If you've got a deck that can easily get this out of your graveyard and in play, paying just 2 mana to get it into your graveyard and get you a mountain as well is a huge value. So I think this can be a powerhouse card, but for very specific decks. And obviously, this can see play in cycling-focused decks as well. Next up, let's talk about Wake the Past. It's a sorcery for 5 red, white, and it says return all artifact cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. They gain haste until end of turn. This is a mass reanimation sorcery, but specifically for your artifacts. And giving your artifacts haste is incredibly noteworthy. If you've got some huge artifact creatures in your graveyard, congratulations, you get them all back and then you swing out and you hit your opponents for a ton. Now, this isn't the first mass reanimation artifact spell we've seen so far, but a big difference between this and some of the other ones is that this only affects you. It's a lot more valuable if you just get your artifacts back and you're not getting your opponent's artifacts back too. Regardless, this can easily be a game-ending spell in the right situation. And again, for decks that are looking to sacrifice artifacts and get a lot into your graveyard, this can get you an absurd amount of value all at once. So again, obviously this isn't for every deck, but for artifact-centric decks that are willing to pay that cost, yeah, you can get a lot out of this. And speaking of being willing to pay that cost, there's Triplicate Titan. Triplicate Titan is a 9/9 golem with flying, vigilance, and trample for 9 mana. When it dies, you create a 3/3 golem artifact creature token with flying, a 3/3 golem artifact creature token with vigilance, and a 3/3 golem artifact creature token with trample. So this card is definitely a callback to Wormcoil Engine. Now, Wormcoil Engine only costs 6 mana, it's Death Touch and Lifelink, and it gives you 2 tokens that have each of those. So this technically provides you even more value, but for more mana. That being said, this is a ton of mana. So unless you've got a deck that can produce a ton of mana, reduce cost, or cheat it into play, or reanimate it, you might be hard-pressed to get this in your deck and actually get it out. But especially for decks that can reanimate this and sacrifice it and reanimate it again, you can get a lot of value out of it. So although Wormcoil Engine does see play in around 3% of decks, I don't think this is going to see play in anywhere near as many as that. But for decks that can get this out, they're going to be getting a lot of value out of it. Next up, we've got Angel of the Ruins, which is a 5/7 angel with flying that costs 5 white. It says when it enters the battlefield, exile up to 2 target artifacts and/or enchantments, and it's got plane cycling too. So like our friend Ruin Grinder, we can cycle it, but this time we're cycling for a plains instead of a mountain. And again, like Ruin Grinder, we might want to cheat this out from our graveyard and sacrifice it and get it back for a ton of value. An ETB that exiles up to 2 target artifacts and/or enchantments can be huge. I mean, just think about this in a Blink deck, it's going to be near impossible for your opponents to keep any enchantments or artifacts in play. So though it does cost 7 mana, you're getting a lot of value out of it. And again, for a lot of decks, there are plenty of ways to use and abuse that ETB. So for the right deck, this can be an incredibly powerful card. But now let's move on to another new card with Audacious Reshapers. It's a 3/3 Human Artificer for 2 and a red. It has tap, sacrifice an artifact, reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal an artifact card. Put that card onto the battlefield and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. Audacious Reshapers deals damage to you equal to the number of cards revealed this way. So this is a repeatable madcap experiment, but on a creature. Basically. So if you want to switch out one artifact for another, you are taking a gamble. Obviously that can really pay off though if you sacrifice, say, a small artifact for a Blightsteel Colossus. You might take some damage, but your opponents take, well, death. But my favorite combination with this card is Platinum Empyrean. It says your life total can't change, so I believe, like Madcap Experiment, that would probably work the same way. I don't know, let me know in the comments below. Now, how much play is this gonna see? I'm really not sure. I mean, if you've got an absurd amount of artifacts in your deck, this can provide you a lot of value, especially if you've got artifacts that have ETBs or LTBs. Maybe you tap and sacrifice one that actually wants to go to your graveyard and it draws you a card or something like that, and you get something else off the top and get an ETB from that. So I think for really specific decks, they could really want this card, but for other decks, you might be just spinning the wheel a bit too much and taking too much damage by trying this out. But now let's move on to Dig Site Engineer. Dig Site Engineer is a 3/3 Dwarf Artificer for 2 and a white. It has whenever you cast an artifact spell, you may pay 2. If you do, create a 0/0 colorless construct artifact creature token with this creature gets ++1 for each artifact you control. So now your artifact spells can essentially make constructs for an extra 2 mana. Now constructs like these in an artifact deck can definitely be powerful. You've got a ton of artifacts in play and they can get pretty huge. But 2 mana might be a bit too much to pay for a lot of decks. If it was 1 mana, I could see this being a lot better and definitely a consideration for a lot more decks. But at 2, that might just be a bit too much. Again, that's just my initial quick take though, and I could be vastly underestimating this. Next up, we also got a new land with Study Hall. Study Hall can tap for a colorless, and we pay 1 and tap it and add 1 mana of any color. When we spend this mana to cast our commander, we scry X for X the number of times it's been cast from the command zone this game. So the more our commander dies, the more we scry. In a deck that really wants you to scry, sure, this can be very useful. But in all honesty, I'm not exactly sure how useful this is going to be for the vast majority of decks. It is similar to Path of Ancestry, but Path of Ancestry is different in a couple of ways. Yes, that does come into play tapped, and this doesn't, but with this one, if you want to actually use that mana fixing and you actually want to scry, you need to pay for it. So I would much rather have that upfront cost of the land coming to play tapped than having to pay for it each time. Again, on this, I could be very wrong though. And finally, 3 new commanders were revealed as well with Alabu, Lorehold, and Lelia. And my apologies for mispronouncing any of those names. Now right now I obviously don't have time to do full quick takes on these, but I might try to later if I can. That being said, I'll give you my immediate impressions of them. Alabu Ancient Witness is a 4/5 golem for 3 red white. She has other artifact creatures you control on haste, and whenever one or more artifact creatures you control attack, Alabu Ancient Witness deals X damage to any target and you scry X for X the number of tapped artifacts you control. So this commander allows you to utilize your artifact creatures right away. And keep in mind that includes artifact mana dorks like Palladium Mirror. And then when you do attack with just one of them, you can dish out a ton of damage and scry a lot based on the number of tapped artifacts you control. Now scrying isn't card advantage, but it is card selection, so it can help you get down to the right cards that you need. And I can see some damage doublers being very impactful with this. Or, you know, Grafted Exoskeleton. Definitely use Grafted Exoskeleton, in fact for the win. Anyways, next up we've got Lorehold Clockwork Scholar, a 2/4 Elfin Artificer for 2 and a white. It says prevent all combat damage to be dealt to attacking artifact creatures you control, and whenever one or more artifact creatures enter the battlefield under your control, draw a card. This ability only triggers once each turn. So this is an artifact creature combat-centric commander that can provide you card advantage. You can swing out with your things and not really worry about them. Now again, unfortunately, there is a limit to the number of cards that you can draw each turn with this, which is 1, but that's better than nothing in mono white. Keep in mind that this can be on any turn, so if you've got creatures with flash, or if you've got blink effects, you can really utilize those. And finally, there's Lelia, the Blade Reforged, a 2/2 Spirit Warrior with haste that costs 2 and a red. Whenever it attacks, exile the top card of your library. You may play that card this turn. Whenever you exile one or more cards from your library and or graveyard, put a +1 counter on Lelia. So you get some card advantage, and you can get Lelia pretty big if you've got the right cards to do so. If you've got other effects that can exile cards at the top of your library or your graveyard, you can get her huge in no time. So that will wrap things up on this episode, but I'd love to hear from you, so in the comments below, let me know what your favorite spoilers are. Or let me know what mistakes I made in this episode, because again, my apologies if I made any of those. I tried to make it as quickly and as efficiently as I possibly could. And with that, this show is coming to a close, so it's my turn to hear from you. So in the comments below, let me know what your thoughts on this episode are, and as always, thanks again and have a good one.